Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into what is honestly a massive economic detective story. If you've been paying any attention to global policy lately, you know tariffs have completely stormed back to the absolute center of the conversation. But right behind all those loud headlines and flashy government press releases lies this fascinating and often totally misunderstood reality. So let's trace the money trail together and uncover who's actually footing the bill here.
So picture this. A government announces a brand new 25% tariff on some imported products. Instantly, we've got a mystery to solve. When that massive cargo container finally reaches the border, who is actually paying that tax? Is it the foreign government? Is it the overseas factory? Or is it you standing at the checkout counter at your local store? Well, the answer is way more complex than what you'll usually hear on a campaign trail.
The political messaging around tariffs is almost always super simple, right? It's catchy. Foreign producers have been taking advantage of us, and this tariff is going to make them pay. And look, I get it. It sounds like a straightforward penalty slapped entirely on a rival nation. But the economic reality? Yeah, it's actually this incredibly messy, hidden web where the true cost gets quietly swallowed up by domestic businesses and everyday consumers.
Okay, mechanically speaking, a tariff is literally just a tax charged on goods the moment they enter a country. But here is the absolutely crucial detail that gets conveniently left out of the public debate. That tax is normally paid by the importing company to their own customs authority. It is not paid by the foreign country.
Let's actually just walk through the math on this for a second. Say a domestic importer buys a foreign machine for $1,000. The government then slaps a 20% tariff on it. To even get that machine through the port and onto domestic soil, the importer has to physically hand over an additional $200. The foreign government isn't writing that check at all. The local importing company is.
And that brings us to this massive, yet kind of subtle distinction in economics. There is a huge gap between the legal payer and the ultimate economic burden. The legal payer is super visible. It's the importer handing over cold hard cash at the border. But that final economic burden? Well, to survive, that importer might just hike up their retail prices, squeeze their own profit margins, or lean on their suppliers. That cost spreads like a ripple in a pond through prices, wages, and profits, and it happens entirely out of sight.
So if tariffs cause all this domestic friction, why in the world are they suddenly everywhere again? For literally decades after World War II, the undisputed goal globally was trade liberalization, lowering barriers to drop costs. But a series of massive shocks changed everything. The 2008 financial crisis fractured a lot of trust. Then 2020 hit, and the pandemic exposed just how dangerous it is to depend on distant suppliers for essential goods. Fast forward to today, and energy shocks and geopolitical rivalries have pretty much entirely rewritten the global rulebook.
Which brings us to the new favorite buzzword in global trade, friendshoring. Governments aren't just looking around asking, hey, where can this widget be made the absolute cheapest anymore? Now they're asking, wait, can we actually rely on that country if a major crisis hits? Trade policy is now deeply, inextricably tangled up with national security, and it's triggering this massive push to move production toward politically trusted partners. So, with tariffs making a comeback as a tool for this resilience, we gotta circle back to our core mystery. Who actually absorbs that final cost? And honestly, there's no one-size-fits-all answer here. It really all comes down to leverage. If a domestic buyer has immense negotiating power and a ton of alternative suppliers to choose from, the foreign producer might actually just eat the cost to keep the contract. But if the product relies on highly specialized tech and there are literally zero alternatives, the importer has zero leverage. That means the cost gets passed straight down the line, eventually landing right in your lap.
And this creates a fascinating and honestly kind of ironic ripple effect across the economy. A product sitting on a store shelf with a proud, patriotic, made-at-home sticker on it, yeah, that can absolutely become way more expensive because of a tariff. Why? Simply because domestic businesses desperately rely on imported parts to make their stuff. A local farmer needs imported fertilizer, a local hospital buys foreign medical scanners, a domestic automaker needs imported microchips. When those raw inputs get taxed, the cost of entirely domestic production shoots straight up.
This dynamic right here exposes a really vital political reality. It's all about concentrated benefits versus dispersed costs. A tariff might do a brilliant job protecting one very specific local steel mill, letting them hire, say, 50 new workers. That's a highly visible, incredibly photogenic victory for a politician. But the costs? Those are totally dispersed and basically invisible. The construction firms, the machinery builders, the automakers that buy that steel, and the everyday consumers buying washing machines, they all just quietly absorb slightly higher prices to subsidize it.
Which naturally leads us to probably the loudest, most popular argument you hear from tariff supporters. do they actually bring jobs back? I mean, we know for sure they can protect jobs in one targeted, sheltered industry, but does that actually translate into a net win for a country's overall workforce?
Well, an overall job boom is absolutely not a guarantee. In fact, frequently the exact opposite happens. Any job gains in that protected steel note we talked about can be completely wiped out by massive layoffs in downstream industries that are suddenly struggling with higher input costs. On top of that, consumers are paying higher prices, so they have less disposable income to spend at other businesses. And surprisingly, even the protective factory might not hire many people. They might just take their extra profits and heavily automate their assembly lines. Worst of all, permanently shielding an inefficient industry pretty much kills their incentive to innovate.
Then, of course, there is the messy reality of retaliation. Because tariffs are almost never just a one-sided punch. They trigger full-blown trade wars. Country A imposes a tax, country B says, oh yeah, and strikes back by restricting critical minerals or heavily subsidizing its own exports. Suddenly, this massive cloud of uncertainty rolls in over the global economy. Multinational companies just freeze. They delay investments and stop hiring because they have absolutely no idea what the rules are going to be tomorrow. It's exactly why major institutions constantly warn that these retaliatory spirals actively weaken global economic output.
Now, a major goal of a lot of recent tariffs has been to isolate specific rival countries and reduce our reliance on them. But if you look at the data, it reveals a fascinating loophole called trade diversion. This is what happens when trade is simply redirected through third-party countries instead of being eliminated entirely. The global trade map doesn't necessarily shrink, it just gets a whole lot more complicated.
Let's actually look at how this escape illusion plays out in the real world. Step 1, massive tariffs hit Chinese imports. Step 2, to legally dodge those tariffs, the final assembly of the product shifts over to a factory in Vietnam or Mexico. But step 3 is where you see the catch. The underlying, critical components for that product, they still originate in China. In some cases, it's actually Chinese firms building the brand new factories in Mexico. So the shipping label changes, sure, but the core production network barely even blinks.
Now, while this trade diversion might sound like an absolute golden ticket for developing nations to swoop in and grab business, it really isn't automatic. A country doesn't just magically win new factories because global tariffs shifted. Take an economy like Pakistan, for example. There are massive opportunities there in textiles and IT, but to actually capture that diverted trade, exporters desperately need reliable energy, highly competitive logistics, and predictable tax policies. You literally cannot join the newly reorganized global supply chain without fixing your own domestic constraints first.
So ultimately, what we're seeing today is governments consciously making a massive, historic trade-off. They are actively choosing to sacrifice pure economic efficiency, that long-standing pursuit of rock-bottom prices and global specialization, and trading it for national security and strategic autonomy. The driving question at the highest levels of government has fundamentally shifted from where is this cheapest to can we actually rely on them when the next crisis hits?
Given all this economic friction, the totally invisible costs hitting consumers, and the constant looming risk of retaliation, it is completely fair to ask, are tariffs just a universally bad idea? Are they just a flawed political stunt? Actually, the truth is highly nuanced. Tariffs are neither purely good nor purely evil. Their actual economic value depends entirely on their purpose, how they are designed, and crucially, how long they last. There are absolutely defensible, totally strategic uses for them. They make perfect sense when a country faces genuine, pressing national security risks or when they need to provide temporary relief during severe supply chain shocks. They can also act as really powerful leverage in international trade negotiations or temporarily shield what we call an infant industry until it finds its footing. But here's the secret. The smartest industrial policies tie this protection to very strict performance requirements. The whole goal should be to build an industry capable of surviving on its own 2 feet, not just to coddle it forever.
So if broad permanent tariffs carry so many hidden economic risks, why do they remain so incredibly popular with voters? Simple. They offer a powerful, remarkably easy-to-tell story. A politician can stand right in front of a protected, deeply recognizable local factory and boldly declare, I saved these jobs. It's a highly visible, easy win. Meanwhile, the costs? Totally invisible. They're camouflaged as a few extra cents spread out across thousands of everyday products, paid for by millions of consumers who will literally never trace that tiny price hike all the way back to the border.
Tariffs change corporate behavior, they redraw the entire geography of global trade, and they absolutely create winners and losers. But one thing they never do is create a free lunch. So the next time you hear a political promise that another country is going to pay the tariff,
I want you to remember the economic detective work we did today. The initial payment may happen at the border, but the final bill, that almost always arrives much closer to home. So the next time you're standing at the checkout counter, ask yourself, what invisible geopolitical tax are you actually paying for? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the reality behind those headlines.